From the University of Nebraska at Omaha, this is NCITE Insights. I'm your host, Blake Ersch. Welcome, everybody. This is NCITE Insights. I am your host, Blake Ersch. This week, our nation is reflecting on the 30th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing. On April 19th, 1995, a truck detonated outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City. And that bombing remains the deadliest terror attack in the United States that wasn't committed by a foreign terrorist organization. 168 people were killed, including 19 children. I am here today with Ann Barnes. She's the interim vice president and chief financial officer for the University of Nebraska System. And Ann was in Oklahoma City, less than a mile away from the bombing, the day of the bombing. And so we're going to talk to her about her experience that day and just kind of where this event sits in the cultural memory at this particular moment. So welcome, Ann. Thank you so much for being here today.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
So just to start off, could you just kind of tell the story of where you were on April 19th, 1995, and what your experience was regarding the bombing?
Sure. I was a relatively new employee at the OU Health Science Center. I was sitting in one of our office buildings in a meeting with a few other folks, and it was a nice warm spring day, and all of a sudden we heard and felt this horrific sound. Many of us rushed outside the building to try to figure out what was going on. And when we looked to the southwest toward the downtown area, we could see this huge plume of smoke. And then obviously very soon after that, all of the emergency vehicles. Being the main academic medical center for the state of Oklahoma, many of our clinical faculty, were immediately called in to participate in much of the triage and care for all of those that were impacted by the bombing. So it was really an incredible experience, incredibly frightening. In fact, at that point, later towards lunchtime, they sent all of the employees home because we didn't know what was going on, and many of the other state buildings had threats called in, and so they sent everybody home. So besides the medical professionals, most of campus cleared out.
When did it become clear to you, or when did you finally become aware just what exactly had transpired?
So again, once I'd gotten home, the news crews immediately started showing footage of the building, and it was just such a stark impression that left, because so much of the north side of that building was just gone. You literally could see in all of the different floors of the building, many of the lower floors pancaked, but you could, see the exposed offices and just where the bomb had ripped away the north side of the building.
Can you talk about what transpired in the days, weeks, months afterwards, and how how it impacted the local community?
Yeah, I think initially, many people thought this was some kind of foreign attack. Many of us, I think, were very surprised when Timothy McVeigh was, I think, almost accidentally caught. I think many people, realized that, if we're not the trooper that pulled him over, it might not have turned out that he was caught. So again, it was very surprising that this was, a U.S. citizen that had carried out this horrific act.
So as we were speaking earlier, you were in Oklahoma City for almost 30 years after the bombing, correct? So
Yep.
How did this event kind of shape your career personally and professionally?
Yeah, so, I think it's one of those things that many of the people that were there at the time and people, that you came in contact with, if it came up in conversation, it was one of those, milestones where you would ask, were you here at the time? Where were you? And everyone had their story of, people that they might have known that were impacted, by it either directly or indirectly. I know afterwards they created the Oklahoma City Memorial Marathon. I participated in the half marathon and the marathon relay a number of times. I always appreciated the fact that race many races like that will segregate people into different starting corrals for ease of start and not keeping it so congested. But I really appreciated that those race leaders have everybody there so that it is a unified start. Because I think the intent afterwards was really to bring people together and to share that memorial experience.
Why do you think it's important, now here we are almost 30 years later to remember Oklahoma City?
Because I think it's one of those things where, because it was a U.S. citizen that carried out this atrocity, it's something that we have to think about to make sure that it's not repeated. I think that's one of the main focus areas of the memorial and the museum. The survivor tree. There's definitely a lot of hope that came around afterwards. I think as we were talking earlier, Oklahoma City used that as a little bit of a pivot, I think, in its history. They wanted to create, new opportunities, kind of a new hope type of thing. And so there was a lot of development in Oklahoma City after the bombing. There was a vote by the people to have a 1 cent sales tax that was an economic development boon. Allowed them to build the arena and the convention center, many of the things that allowed them to grow, really develop as a city. But even more, it's just the mindset of, this shouldn't be something that, is always viewed as a negative. Look for the upside of it, but never forget those people that were so tragically murdered.
Mm-hmm. We were talking a little bit about this earlier, and I do eventually want to talk about just kind of how this event lives in the national memory, especially for young people. But as we were saying, like I said, I was about 4 years old when the bombing happened. To me, it's very much something that has always been happening has happened in the past. I'm wondering how, in 6 years later, we had 9/11 happen. That has very much been a flashbulb memory for lots of people. How do you think 9/11 happening reasonably soon after this has shaped kind of the public memory of Oklahoma City?
Yeah, I think it's one of those where, when something happens and you've experienced a tragedy like that, you have a tendency to kind of jump to the conclusion, maybe first before others around you. Um, the first plane hitting one of the towers on 9/11, it was so horrifying, but you thought, well, maybe it was an accident. But then you start wondering, no, there's not a likelihood. Then the second plane hits the other tower, and you immediately know that was not, that something horrific had gone on, and it was going to be really, really bad. A number of the clinicians that I got to know personally over those, many years that I was at OU, they were physicians that participated in much of the care of the people impacted by the Oklahoma City bombing. I know that 9/11 was very difficult for many of them because of the trauma of carrying out that care in such a, you know, uh, unusual circumstance. One of my very good friends was the chair of orthopedic surgery at the time, and actually had to go into the bombing, the Murrah building afterwards, and had to amputate a woman's leg on site so that they could get her out of the building. So it's those kind of things that come back up when any of these other events happen. So those people have to live with that, for the rest of their lives.
Do you, those of us who work at universities, and everyone in this room, there's someone over here, Ben, producer, also works at a university.
Mhm.
Um, do you ever encounter, well, I guess my question would be, have you ever spoken about this to young people just in the course of your career? And just what experience have you heard from young people at universities as far as their awareness of Oklahoma City?
I really haven't talked to people within my professional role as much. Obviously, I have two grown daughters. My oldest was alive on 9/11. My youngest was not. But it was something that we always talked about. Again, with them living in Oklahoma, growing up in Norman, they very much were, familiar with the story. They visited those things. But I think it's one of those where, we always say after a tragedy, never forget. but these really are those kind of things that, we have to think about all the things that led up to this kind of a horrific event and then try to figure out what we can do to, not allow, kids to become radicalized, not allow, those kind of vulnerabilities to be exploited. Those are the kind of things, those are the messages for me that I think are important.
Do you think in the years since that we have just kind of as a country seen some positive development since the tragedy, positive ways of preventing these kinds of attacks from happening? Just what's your take on that as someone who was so close to the site of the bombing?
I would love to say that we've done a lot more. I think there is an awareness. I think there is definitely an effort for that. My concern is that we still continue to have, the mass shootings. We still seem to have these events where, maybe it's on a smaller scale, but it's this role that people play in trying to, bring attention to themselves, bring attention to their, to their cause. Some of those other kind of, maybe smaller scale, but still tragic for the people involved. Those are the things that I would love to see that, we get better control over. But I do think there's an awareness. I think there's, always an effort out there. It's just it's a lot to deal with.
Mhm. Have you been to the, I mean, obviously you lived there for a while, so this is probably a dumb question, but have you been to the memorial site? And if so, what was your experience like just visiting there?
Oh, it is. Yes, I have been there, and it is incredibly moving. Particularly, so it's chairs. They're laid out in rows based on the floors that the victims were on, and there are the chairs that represent the children that were in the daycare, and they're smaller chairs, and so that is incredibly hard. That is one of those incredibly moving experiences. I also visited the 9/11 Memorial in New York soon after it opened, and I had a very similar experience. It kind of called back, that memory of seeing the bombing memorial the first time. It's incredibly moving.
Do you do you think there's anything about the choices that you've made professionally that is been impacted by your experience with the bombing? Any even ways I find that a lot of times there are things that I have been affected by in my life that I didn't even really conceive of, and so I'm just kind of wondering, like, in what way you see the trajectory of your life being impacted having been there.
So I would say, again, at the time of the bombing, I was in the internal audit department. I had an accounting degree, and so the fact that I moved into the College of Medicine and became so familiar with, many of the clinical faculty that were part of this, understood how it impacted them. I definitely think, my appreciation for, what they sacrificed, what they do on a daily basis. I so appreciated and had a lot of pride in working in an academic medical center, environment. Incredibly proud of all the things that we do here in Nebraska at UNMC and all of our campuses. And it's one of those things where you just realize when you get to visit each campus how much is contributed to the public good. And so I would say that that's probably for me as much as anything. I recall, leaving committee meetings with some of our clinicians, and I'd say, okay, go save some lives, and they would joke, oh no, I'm like, no, really, you do that. That is part of your, job description. That's part of what you do on a daily basis. And so, if that's just, if I have one small part in making them more successful, then I'm very proud of that.
What what do you hope Americans, we're at this point that we're recording, we're 2 days away from the anniversary. What do you hope people do on April 19th? How do you hope the date, how do you hope they reflect on that date?
I hope everyone takes that as an opportunity to think about the things that bring us together, the things that we have in common, the things that make us proud to be US citizens, and realize that, it's too easy to get mad. It's too easy to think about the hate. It's too easy to let into some of those, those emotions. I hope people think about, again, the way that we can come together as a country and stop letting things pull us apart.
That's great. I really appreciate your time today, and thank you so much for sharing your story with us, and
Sure.
Have a great rest of your day.
Awesome. Thank you.
This series is produced by Ben Batafarano, Aaron Grace, Scott Jordan, and Blake Ersch. Thank you for joining us on another episode of NCITE Insights. NCITE is an academic center of excellence for the Department of Homeland Security. Looking for more info? Check out our website at incite.unomaha.edu or email us at incite@unomaha.edu.